Hello and welcome to our webinar on how to help your board get involved with fundraising. My name's Dan Francis. I am the Senior Governance Consultant here at NCVO. I lead all of our work on charity governance, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined here today by Carol Weisman. Carol joins us from the US, where she has served on the board of 40 boards and has been president of 9 not-for-profit organizations. I was currently president of one and has served on 8 others, right? Primarily not-for-profit. She's the author of 11 books on fundraising, governance, and philanthropy. Her book, Raising Charitable Children, has been covered by the New York Times, Money Magazine, Parade Magazine, and was featured in The Guardian here in the UK, as well as Child Magazine. Becoming One of the Grateful Dead, Where There's a Will, There's a Way, is due for publication on November 1st, so we're looking forward to that, and hopefully we'll hear about it today. She consults, trains, and speaks in the US as well as internationally, and since founding her Board Builders 25 years ago, has been involved in lots of activity with not-for-profit organizations. Her favorite activities are training board members to become fundraising superheroes, working with individuals and their families who want to leave a lasting legacy. Carol is one of the few fundraising experts who has also done stand-up comedy. When not speaking, writing, and training, she trains with an elite group of runners called the Chafing Dishes. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Carol, it's great to be joined with you today. And so the format for today is that Carol's going to take us through some slides, and then we're going to open it up for questions. But as we're going, we invite you to write the questions that you have into the type bar, and we will address them at the end.
Basically, what I'm going to talk about today is how to recruit board members who are going to fundraise. And we'll also talk about people who are currently on your board. But I want to make it very clear, I did not vote for Trump. But I think Trump teaches us a lot of interesting lessons about governance. What's interesting about Trump is that he has never had to report to a board. He has a family-owned business. He is not a team player. And so when you look for board members, you have to find somebody who is also a team player, because governance is a team sport. And if you're not willing to play nicely with others, you can't fire them. When the president of a board says you're fired, everybody just laughs. It does not work. So, and I love your balloon you had here. It was a big hit in the United States. So I'm saving up my money for my own. In governance, there are good surprises and bad surprises. And the good surprise, of course, is always winning the Irish sweepstakes. But a bad surprise, and many of you will go through this, is that as times are changing, people will say we have to start raising funds. And that means you, my fellow board member. And if they didn't come in knowing that they had to raise funds or give funds, the give or get, they are not happy. And trust me, this is a big myth. Nobody in the United States, or I dare say the UK, joins a board because they think it's a great opportunity to fundraise. Nobody likes.
So that's even the case in the US in terms of
Absolutely.
expectations.
I joined my first board when I was 23 and I'm almost 70, and I started getting in, and they told me I had to fundraise, so I went out and did it because I didn't know that I could say no. That was a long time ago, but I wasn't taught, and I had some really horrific experiences because I didn't know what I was doing. And now if somebody says no, I cry for way less than an hour. No, but really, but you have to get used to that. It may not be the right fit.
Yeah.
And so you have to train people. But Americans don't like to fundraise any more than anybody else.
That's interesting.
And I think one of the reasons is we define fundraising wrong. We, both in the United States and in England, think fundraising is asking for money. And it's a process. And we're going to talk about how you can get involved in the fundraising process and never make an ask. So when you start thinking about how you're making your money now, you really have to look at who would be the best fundraising fundraiser for your current method or a future methodology. And if you are getting more than 50 or 60% of your money from one source, you are in deep trouble. And the reason is, and we've found this in the United States, is that our government is on shaky grounds. And so if you're an ecology organization, that's been cut. Their budget has been cut tremendously. Health has been cut. The arts have been cut. The humanities have been cut. Just about everybody that has taken a hit. And so you have several choices. You can either fundraise as a board, or you can shut down or give less services.
Yeah. And so what you're saying is that it's at a board level that those kind of decisions are having to be taken, and boards are starting to have to think about those things even in the US, where they perhaps didn't have to before. Is that right?
Yes, I think we've always had to, but the other thing that's happened in the US is that when I started Board Builders in 1994, there were 750,000 nonprofits. Now they're 1.8 million.
Whoa. Okay.
It's a lot of competition. Right. So if you're getting government grants, you want someone high in the government if they can help you along. If you are interested in online fundraising, and don't fall into the trap of thinking that's just young people. There's some of us really old people who know how to do this stuff. And federated giving is when you give through work.
Right.
And so you want CEOs who will let you into their organization to raise funds. But I think what's interesting that's happening here is you are sort of following the US in the sense that 70% of all gifts in the US are by individuals.
Right. And that figure in the UK is around about 40, but that includes legacies and it includes purchases and use of services. So it's not just strictly from fundraising and giving. Whereas
we have bequests, which are gifts in your will. Dead people give more than corporations in the United States. Right. So there's where you want your old people.
Yeah.
And major gift fundraising. And again, it depends on who is giving to you currently. So if you're getting a lot of money for direct mail, that's usually people 60 and over. Millennials do not tend to respond to direct mail. Digital fundraising will work quite well, crowdsourcing, that sort of thing. So if you want to go in one direction, then you're going to get a 29-year-old who has a list of, maybe an email list of 5,000, rather than someone like my husband who doesn't have an email address.
Yeah.
He's not your hot ticket.
Yeah. So is it for a board to have a discussion about these topics, these potential routes and avenues, and to decide which is most appropriate?
Right, and it has to be a multi-pronged approach.
Right.
Because if the government just crosses a line out, and that's your line,
yeah,
you're out of business.
Sure.
And that's happened to some of the nonprofits I've worked with, where 90% of their funding is from government. So it's gone. And so if you don't have an endowment, you're toast.
So boards need to take this stuff seriously.
Absolutely. And then you turn over what you're looking for to the nominating committee. Here is some information on fundraising in the UK and in England, and it's just a lot of great information. 3 strategies you need to commit to if you want to fundraise. Be clear on what your fundraising strategy is. So if you're going to go digital, if you're going to have a couple of events, and then also you're going to do grant writing. Get buy-in from current members and create a fundraising training plan for your board. When you ask people to fundraise, you have to train them. Just like, I don't want to fly in a plane where the pilot hasn't been updated on the newest equipment. I don't know about the rest of you.
Yeah.
I also don't like lithium batteries for the same reason, but I'll tell you the story about Gans Fernandez. I was doing some board recruiting for Friends of the Children's Eternal Rainforest, which is in Costa Rica. And I said, what exactly do you want? And they were very clear. They said, we have 600 acres of land in Costa Rica that's undeveloped that we need to sell.
Right.
So what we need is a Spanish-speaking attorney that knows international real estate law.
It's quite niche.
Yes, and we prefer if you were Catholic.
Sure.
Because we don't have any Catholics on the board, and this place was their home base. They had a lot of different religious groups, and Catholics in that city were very generous, so they wanted a Catholic. And it only took me 1 week to find God's. And I went to the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, and I said, I'm looking for a bilingual real estate attorney who knows.
Do you have your fingers crossed behind your back? Please, come on.
I didn't. I just had this stupid idea that this couldn't be that hard.
Yeah.
And so sometimes just dumbness will work for you. And so they gave me Gonzalez's name. And then I went to the Bar Association and asked them, and they said immediately Gons.
Right.
So I called Gons and had coffee with him, and he was very interested. And then I said, tell me about your family. And his wife was an accountant and had a degree in marketing. So I got a twofer. And his wife joined the board. And so she helped us with our accounting and our marketing. And Gons, this is 8 years ago, is still trying to sell the land.
Right.
It was not an easy sale. But the more you know exactly what you want, then the easier it is.
So you've got to define that. I'm interested in that point about buy-in.
Yes, everybody has to be clear. So for instance, if you're going to make a lot of money and you think you're going to make a lot of money with a very upscale gala, do you say gala or gala?
Gala.
Gala, I thought so. I'm somewhat bilingual. And so then you need people who will bring a table, who will buy a table, who have friends that want to go. So if you have a group of young people, millennials, that's a pretty bad way to raise money because they're not to say they're none, but there are very few millennials who enjoy that sort of event and who have that kind of money, whether it's 100 pounds or 50 pounds or 250 pounds, 500 pounds, whatever the amount is, they're not going to get a table of 10. So you need a different kind of board for that method. Is the talent in the room? And there's two issues on this. One is, do you have people who know about your subject matter? And that's not just staff, that's also board. So for instance, we could sit here for 5 hours, and if our topic were to create a plan to defuse a nuclear weapon, we're not going to get anywhere. I don't know, maybe Rob, who's doing our IT, could do it, but certainly not the rest of us. So you need somebody with the knowledge in the room.
Yeah.
And so, but here's the problem. Sometimes they can't fundraise or won't fundraise. In other words, fundraising meaning asking for money.
Right.
And so there's the case of Dr. Edie Zussman. And Edie is a neurosurgeon, and she also is a busy mom, and she's involved in all sorts of things. And she joined a board, and she said, Carol, I've got a big problem. The university that pays my salary will not let me fundraise for anybody but the university.
Right. Okay.
So I can't ask my patients.
Yeah.
I can't.
And we come across this with some corporates that we work with as well.
Yeah.
Companies say
Absolutely.
you can't fundraise. Yeah.
And so I said, Edie, would you be willing to make thank you calls? And she said, absolutely.
Right.
So she had, I believe she had a child that was doing ice hockey. So she'd go to the arena every Thursday with her kid, and she'd get on the phone and make thank you calls to current donors. And I spent about a half an hour training her. So she would say, hello, this is Dr. Zussman. This is not a medical emergency. I'm calling to thank you for your gift. And she had a 92 to 93% second gift and higher gift.
Right.
If she talked to the person, and 89% if she left a message.
Wow.
And when you start doing a lot of fundraising, you really need to know whether it's a grant or an individual, what your donor retention rate is.
Yeah.
And usually in the United States, it's around 50%. So she was really hitting it out of the park.
Yeah.
So, but she never asked for money, never once. So if you have a great experience and are well stewarded and well thanked,
You never need to make the ask. in that respect.
Right.
Yeah.
And people just kept sending money in because she was so terrific. I'm going to spend a little time going through the recruiting process, and this is kind of the big picture. Determine what kind of board you want to have. And we're talking about what kind of fundraising board.
Mm-hmm.
So do you want a local board, regional, advisory, or governance? And I have a big problem with the term advisory board. And the reason is two things. A lot of them don't want advice, they want money. Mm. So it's really a misnomer. But also, there's no governance involved.
Yeah.
And so they really will give you advice. And so some people are much better on that. So your corporate people who can't get involved in making the ask. In the United States, judges can't.
Right.
They do take money from people, but you're not supposed to. Determine who would be a candidate. So you determine a need on the board. So we know we need somebody who knows about early childhood education, or perhaps you're the Hemophilia Foundation and you don't have anybody on the board with hemophilia because it had started out as an all parents board.
Yeah.
So you want someone who has hemophilia, and you may want a hematologist. So contact, here, I almost missed the most important point. Point 4. This is where I've had big problems. You have to ask the entire board, do you have any conflicts with this person that we're nominating?
Right.
And I've made so many mistakes here. It has been awful. One time I got 2 people from different oil companies that were litigating. That was a mess. One time I invited somebody's former wife.
That's going to be awkward.
You can't change your name every time you get married, but I mean, it was an honest mistake. And it was just, then one time I actually was on a board and someone said, oh, we can get so-and-so. And she was this very well-known physician. And I wrote in, I will not accept her as a board member currently, unless she says she'll come to board meetings. I have been on a board with her for 3 years and I've never met her.
Right.
So I had nothing against her as a person. Yeah. And she was a minority, and we were trying to get minority members on. So they went back to her and said, are you going to come to board meetings? And she said, I have a busy practice. I'm a GYN. I'm up at night delivering babies. No. And they said, oh. So
it's about this honesty and openness and setting those expectations right there at the front around, A, we need you to fundraise, and B, we also need you to turn up and to be present and to contribute to meetings. Is that?
Exactly. I mean, who would take a job without knowing what the financial issues are?
Yeah.
Well, I assume that none of our listeners took a job without saying, oh, are you going to pay me 15,000 pounds a year or 90? I mean, that's the kind of thing someone might want to know. What are my expectations? Can I work from home? All that sort of thing. So it should be spelled out, and we're going to be talking about a letter of agreement. If there's interest but no time, you can put these people on a committee.
Yeah.
So especially people that have second homes, so somebody may have spent 3 or 4 months in Spain, and so that person can't come to meetings for 4 months, or maybe they are involved with trade with China and they're traveling all over the world. That's not a good board member if they can't make at least 60 to 70% of the meetings. Yeah. And it's not that you don't love them, it's not that you're not going to work with them, but that's not a board member. Okay. Then you have to nominate them. This number 7 is a little tricky. Sometimes people want to join boards because they have a huge gap in their life. They've been taking care of their mother for 5 years and she just died. Their oldest child or their youngest child went off to college, or as you would say, uni. And something has happened in their lives that they want to fill a hole.
Yeah.
And if it's been a big loss.
And I think particularly some, certain causes, that is definitely the case. And I think particularly where there are organizations where beneficiaries or service users are on the board, that can be quite acute. Right?
My sister did this, and she often talks about it. She lost a child with sudden infant death syndrome and immediately joined the board. And every single meeting, she was talking to people who had lost their children. and it was devastating. And so she said I needed to wait around 5 years. So onward, if there's interest, propose, and then go ahead and nominate. The board commitment letter, attendance policy. You need to let them know when the meeting is, what time, what's expected, but more importantly, do you pay your own transportation? So if you're having your meeting in Geneva or in Johannesburg or Manchester, even Manchester, you need to know whether you're expected to pay.
Yeah. And I think actually in the UK, this is something where we are really trying to encourage boards to be claiming their expenses for this reason, that actually it is an accessibility point. It's something which helps to diversify the board, the idea of you getting this culture where it's okay to claim expenses, and if you don't need the money, you gift it back.
And what's so nice is if you can pay for some of the board members, you have more financial diversity. So if you make it a requirement that everybody pays for themselves, and you're an international nonprofit, and one year you're meeting in Barcelona and the next year you're meeting in Rio, you can only get rich people.
Yeah.
And I have nothing against rich people, but but you don't have a diverse opinion. You talk about a committee assignment, and this is tricky too, because some people you think, oh, you're an accountant, so you'll do our bookkeeping, and a lot of people want to do what they don't do in their day-to-day life. So yeah. Your accountant may want to be on your grounds committee or on your building committee, or
so they're leaving their expertise at the door, perhaps.
Yes, because they want to learn, and it's something they're very interested in. And what I find with some of these people is they ask the hardest, best questions. So let's say it's a preschool and you get an accountant says, I want to learn about this. They'll ask questions of the staff that many donors would want to know. So should we start at 2? Should we start at 3? Should we start at 18 months? What's the best way to teach? Should we do phonics? Blah, blah, blah. And they have to be able to answer.
Yeah, okay.
And so it's very valuable. Send 2 copies, one for the board member and one for the office. And the reason you do it, you have them sign a copy, is that some people are auditory learners and some are visual learners. So you could have told something to someone and it kind of goes in one ear and out the other. And I know all about that. I've been married to a man like that for 42 years. I adore him. But if I write it down, he'll actually get it. So if I tell him go and get bread and milk, he'll come back with cheese and salami. But if I write it down, bread and milk it is.
So that's something about being very, very clear about these commitments from the start, in writing. This is what we're expecting and asking of you as a board member.
And here's the hardest question. Is do you want to have a minimum donation? So some boards have a minimum donation of anywhere from $25 to $100,000.
And I do think that is quite different in the UK.
Yes.
I don't think there are lots of expectation around fundraising, because it is that not fundraising, personal giving to the organisation.
And I think you're going to be seeing more and more of that if programs are defunded.
Right.
Is the first person to give has to be the board.
Yeah. Okay.
And so that's going to be kind of an interesting trend. There are all kinds of places in the UK, and these are some of the UK, I'm sorry, British. Here are a few more places. The society pages, business journals, professional publications, at special events. And I'll give you an example. I was at a gala one time, and I was talking to this man who was just standing in the corner, and I said, how did you get here? And he said, I'm a friend of Barbara, an FOB. The friend of Bruce, friend of Barbara, FOB. So I said, do you know much about this cause? And he said, no, but I'm fascinated. This is something I've always been interested in. And it happened to have been a human trafficking organization. So I said, would you like me to set up lunch or coffee? And so that's exactly what we did. And he wound up joining the board.
Yeah.
And it was just because he was standing by himself.
It's interesting. Networks, I think, still play a big role in board recruitment. Something like 60% of all boards here in the UK are still recruited through that informal route.
The problem with this method is that you tend to hang out with people like yourself.
Yes.
And that's why these are some of the other places that I look for board members. And I think what's interesting is this issue of asking donors to join your board. I had a physician many years ago who had given a very large donation to a board I was on, and I knew about the donation. And when I went in to see her for my checkup, I said, "It was so kind of you to give all this money. May I ask why?" And she said, "My daughter had a problem, and I was going through a divorce and blah, 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 and they were incredibly helpful." And I said, "Would you like me to propose you for the board?" And she said, "I would be so honored." And she had donated something like $25,000, which these days is 25,000 pounds.
Yeah.
So, but nobody had ever asked her.
Yeah.
And she was one of the best board members I've ever met.
And that's the same for organizations and individuals, do you feel?
Very much so. Okay. Yeah. Are we a good fit for you? Okay. So if you're doing international aid, you may want to have British Air, so that they're a partner of yours. That makes a lot of sense to transport people and goods. I'm assuming this is the average board in England. So, but you have to teach people. I made so many mistakes because I didn't know how to fundraise, and it's a real skill. And there's a lot of places to get information. The other thing is you have to have a culture of generosity. So when someone misses a bunch of meetings, this happened to me, I missed a bunch of meetings, and I asked a question. I think I missed 3 board meetings. I didn't call in, and it was totally my fault. And someone said, "You know, Carol, you would know the answer to that if you'd been here." Well, my mother was terminally ill. And so I handled it really well. I went in the bathroom and cried for a half an hour. And my mother died about a week later. But they never asked why I hadn't been there. And it was totally my fault that I didn't show up. So you need to have that kind of gracious.
Yeah.
And
the respect for the fact that most board members are still volunteers and to doing this on a voluntary basis.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I didn't care any less about the cause, but this particular cause versus my terminally ill mother.
Yeah.
Forget it. I'm going to be with Mom. And so, and another board I was on when my husband had some surgery, they brought me food. They brought food for us. And my kids asked if Dad could have more surgery because the food was really good. So this is just a thank you to my friend Tessia Pecky, who also works periodically with NCVO, and she translated this from American to English, which drove my spell check nuts. So now I'd love to hear your questions.
Okay, so we've got a few links there to other resources. There's some links also to Carol's books, but we'd like to invite people to ask questions. It's really interesting, I think, that what this presentation did was take us back to basics, really. It said that it starts with the board, and this is just my reflection. It really starts with that recruitment process. But I think there's a really interesting question here around, the old guard.
Yes.
How do you change the view and perspective of people who have been on the board for some time toward fundraising?
Number one, you have to tell them that it can be quite easy. And usually I start with having them make thank you calls or visits, because there are very few people who mind making a call and not asking for more money. And when you increase your donor retention, you're in great shape. So, and that takes some training, is to ask people, why did you give to our cause? Why were we so fortunate?
Yeah.
And I'll give you a short example. I was teaching a bunch of doctors how to fundraise, and they hate it. I don't care what country. I've done it in Bermuda. I've done it all over. But anyway, one of the guys was an orthopedic surgeon, and he made a thank you call. He said, "This is Dr. So-and-so. Not a medical emergency. I'm calling to thank you for your donation. If you've got a minute, I'm curious why you gave it." And the gentleman said, "I'm a physicist, and I was working on a science project with my 6th grader, and he wanted to know how we use robots other than waiting for the zombie apocalypse." And so He said, we use them in our hospital.
Yeah.
And the doctor went off script and he said, next week, I'm going to be teaching interns and we're going to be operating on a frozen chicken. Would you and your grandson like to come? And to make a long story shorter, it resulted in the gift of $1 million for another Da Vinci robot. That's from a thank you call. He never asked.
Right.
Never ever asked.
So I suppose we're back to this point where you don't actually have to be making overt asks. If you've been on the board for a long time and you've never fundraised before,
yes,
it is about putting in place that training to understand that it's not necessarily about having to make an ask. There are other ways.
Absolutely. And so people can write grants, thank you letters, using their lists, using their contacts.
And once you've established that fundraising strategy, I suppose that makes sense.
Right.
Okay, we've got a number of other questions, and I'm only going to be able to pick a few here. So we've got, how important is it, do you think, for every member of a board to give personally to a particular campaign?
If you want other people to give, then 100%.
Yeah.
100%. Because if they don't believe in your organization, there's an old saying, I don't know if it's used here, the fish rots from the head. It's not a nice saying, it's just a saying. But in fact, if you don't demonstrate generosity from the board level, why should I give if you're not giving and you're giving time? And time is not money.
Well, I think that's probably the culture in the UK is around, I'm giving, I may not have the money to give, but I am giving time, expertise, effort, insight as a board member. What do you say to that as a balance? I
think you have to give what's comfortable for you. And I loved this Catholic group I worked with, the Christ Child Society. They were a women's group, and they said you had to give a sacrificial gift. And I imagined that people would be bringing dead goats and children. But in fact, there has to be some language that says, to the best of your ability.
Sure.
So for some people that may be 5 pounds, 10 pounds. For other people, it may be 1 million pounds. I don't.
Well, this actually interestingly leads on to another question that we've been asked, which is, how would you make someone donate for the first time? You know, if you were coaching a board member to make that ask, what is it about, you know, making someone give for the first time?
What would happen if we didn't have funds? That would be the question I would start with. That would mean that we couldn't help the children we're helping now, we can't produce the opera we want, and ask them that question. So we have our choice here. And one of the most powerful phrases that you can ever use, it's a phrase that pays, is, will you join me as a donor? That's a very powerful.
Which comes back to your last point about the importance of the board.
Yes.
Being engaged in making.
Will you join me?
Interesting. Yeah. There's an interesting question here about fundraising tips from students. I don't know if you've done work in that area.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Any particular guidance or tips for that?
I have. This is really obnoxious, but I'm going to brag about my grandson. My grandson was raising money for the American Heart Association, and he didn't quite know what to say. So he raised the most money in kindergarten, but he really did fabulous in first grade. And what happened was, he went to a neighbor and said, I'm doing jump roping on behalf of the American Heart Association. And the man said, how much money do you want? And Freddie said, how much is your heart worth? And that was the phrase that paid. And so for 5 years, he's raised the most money in his entire school, because he hit on that, how much is your heart worth?
And of course, you have written the book Raising Charitable Children, which I imagine probably picks up on some of these coaching techniques.
Yes, yes. It has to be fun for your child.
There's an interesting question here. If a board member feels initially awkward about asking their friends, peers, colleagues, their network for donations, are there techniques or ideas to help them feel more comfortable about asking? You've mentioned that, would you join me as a donor? I think that resonates. Is there anything else to kind of help them feel a little less awkward about making the ask?
There's a phrase in medicine, see one, do one, teach one. And I think going with a partner who's experienced and having a talk beforehand. So let's say you and I were going to ask a friend of yours, and I'm going to say, would you talk about the program, and then I'll make the ask.
Right.
So I'm going to say, are you interested in getting involved? And if the guy says, you know, I'm really involved with PETA or some other cause, or my sister has leukemia, so I'm very interested in that, fine. It's called catch and release.
Yeah.
But if he says, yes, I'm very interested, would you consider joining us as a donor?
Interesting.
So I would take somebody with you who is comfortable.
Yeah.
As many times as you need until you start to get the rhythm.
Okay, so it is about having those board members that are already there and are experienced in this area, coaching, training, supporting those newer, less experienced.
And also at your board retreat, training them in fundraising. So if you tell all about your story, and your story is grim, and let's say it's ALS, and I say, my grandfather died, my brother died, and now my grandson has it. That's not very inspiring.
That's really interesting around the idea of training your board in fundraising, and I do think that there isn't a focus on that here in the UK. I think that we spend a lot of time training boards. I think there's been a real culture of moving toward the board needs to understand its responsibilities. Where we talk about fundraising, I think we talk about regulation. I think we talk about the fundraising regulator and the rules so that they can make informed decisions, but we rarely actually talk about the stuff that you're talking about, which is about equipping them to fundraise themselves.
I think it's a really good idea to stay out of jail. I'm really for that. But in fact, there are real techniques. And one of the biggest mistakes people do is they blab instead of asking questions. So they tell their story. It's about, so let's say I came to you and I'm involved in gardening. And I said, I would start not by telling you about my garden, but saying, have you ever done any gardening? And what would you say?
Is this by way of you asking about getting me to talk about my allotment?
Yes, yes, it is.
We did have a chat earlier about the allotment.
Right.
But yes, so now I'm engaged and I'm interested.
Okay, and tell me about your allotment.
Well, I tell you what, I've eaten nothing but allotment salad all summer, Carol.
What would it be like if you could help others to learn how to get an allotment and what grows best at what season?
Sounds pretty inspiring.
Would you like to learn more about how to get more yield from yours?
I can see where this is going. Yeah. I'm engaged.
Yes. And so you don't care about my allotment. You don't care about my garden.
I care about my allotment.
You care about your garden.
That makes a lot of sense. We've had a question from Anna who's wondering what's the methodology, because we've talked here quite a bit about networks, about using people's own, who do they know, who's in your professional network, who's in your wider network. Anna's interested in, are there tips for mapping those networks? Are there tips for making it without it seeming like a significant task for a board member to share those contacts?
Yes. One of the things you can do is relationship mapping, which is a whole nother retreat program. But also, it's just being aware when you bring someone in to have personal time together.
Yeah.
So if you know your board members well, I think there should always be some social time. So if I find out that your wife is a master gardener and has a PhD in horticulture, and we're a gardening group, I want to know that.
Yeah.
If we want to work with children to teach them something, I want to know if you have children and where do they go to school and how can we get into the school.
Yeah.
So the more I know you and you know me and what my husband does, what my kids do, and this happened just recently. One of my sons is a solar engineer and he does solar roofs, and so as a result was invited to Haiti to do a solar installation for an orphanage, which was, I wouldn't say it was fun, it was very meaningful to him.
Sure.
And we had to make sure that his wife didn't go down there and bring back about 20-30 kids. She's a great promoter of adoption.
That's really interesting. Just a couple more questions that seem to be coming through. we have got, you've talked about the diverse board, and you've talked about the importance of actually having a range of skills, range of expertise at that board level. You know, are there any challenges with that diversity?
Oh, yes. Diversity is a major pain in the neck. And the reason is that if I'm talking to 3 older women who have gone to the same school that I did, who came from the same background, same religion, we agree on things, we know each other, it's very easy to make a decision. So should we go and see Crazy Rich Asians, or should we go and see The Life of Gauguin? Well, we're all the way to the Crazy Rich Asians. So if you have diverse people, then it slows the conversation down. And I'll give you an example. There was a group that formed a food kitchen, and everybody that was involved owned a restaurant. There was no diversity at all. They were all restaurant owners. They built this fabulous facility, state of the art. They were going to train people that they could then use in their kitchen. There was only one problem. Nobody in that group had ever worked with the homeless or been homeless, and it wasn't on a bus route. It took 2 years to get it on a bus route because they had nobody who knew about homelessness.
It's about that mix of skills, expertise, but also, I guess, background and knowledge to make it work, to ask some of those bigger, more strategic questions.
And a simple question. It took 2 years to get the bus going.
That's really interesting, and it's a big topic here in the UK. The new governance code had a section of high-level principle on diversity, recommended practice, which said 3 things. It's about how do we attract people from different backgrounds, you know, different, both protected characteristics, but also different skills, expertise. And you mentioned the skills audit there as a way of helping to inform that recruitment. The second thing it says was, of course, around retention, because it's not just about getting them in a room. You know, we've talked today about, and you've mentioned that it's all very well getting someone on the board, but how do you keep them there? And I think that's really interesting in terms of thinking about how we change the boardroom to be more attractive to different people. And then third, about monitoring it and being open about how diverse we are and thinking about where our gaps are.
Also, I worked with the Special Olympics many years ago about getting some of the athletes on the board, and they couldn't really read the what do you call it, the budget. And so we made it very simple, and we had 3 pictures with smiley face, unsmiley face, and blank, and 1 sentence that said, "We're on target." And it was funny how many of the board members read that rather than the entire budgetary report.
Well, yeah, I think it is really important actually to think about how do we translate information in a way that people understand. And I think I've sat in so many board meetings as an observer where you think actually the majority of people here do not, you know, aren't engaging in it, probably because they are not able to digest what's in these papers. Perhaps, you know, who knows, maybe intentionally they've been complicated. So anything that can be done to simplify board papers, I think, is a good thing.
And we had an award at those board meetings for the best question asked. And so the more people asked questions, the more everyone was informed. It was $100 grand bar.
Carol, we've run out of time for questions, but thank you so much for your time and your insight today into how we get the boards fundraising. What we'll be doing is we'll be circulating the slides for today. Thank you to everybody who has joined us and has asked questions. It's been really insightful, but thank you very much for joining us.
I've had fun.
Thanks very much.